Okay, so we're going to do a slightly different format for the webinars, which is shorter. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to zero in on just the top three economic topics that investors need to know. So the first topic is Vietnam's GDP growth accelerated to 8% in Q2. And that was really all driven by a big surge in exports to the US, which in turn, of course, is driven by the so-called front loading of exports. Like the customers in the US are importing a lot to beat the tariffs, basically. So that's the main factor that drove the acceleration in GDP growth. The other thing that really helped is we're having a surge in the foreign tourist arrivals, and that has to do with some things with the Chinese tourists. So those were the two main factors that boosted Vietnam's economic growth in the first half of the year, 7.5% GDP growth. The domestic consumption, on the other hand, was kind of modest. It was kind of not strong, not weak, but just kind of going along. If you strip out the impact of foreign tourist arrivals, then domestic consumption, by local households basically, was growing at around a 5 or 6% rate. Now, to put that in context, domestic consumption used to grow at around an 8 or 9% pace pre-COVID. And long story short, really what's going on there is the households have never really fully rebuilt their savings after COVID. And that's why you see that last year, the domestic consumption and also consumer sentiment started rebounding from around the middle of the year. And that rebound kind of not too steep, but it just kept kind of improving steadily since the middle of last year until Q1. And now it's sort of flattened out at this healthy, but sub what it used to be type rate. And you would also see in consumer companies kind of reflecting, the revenues of consumer companies are reflecting that as well. So that's what happened in the first half of the year. In the second half of the year, clearly that export growth is not sustainable and that will drop down. You've already seen a big drop in the new orders for exports. On the other hand, what we also saw in the first half of the year is a huge increase in disbursement for infrastructure projects. Now, that having been said, the amount of money that the government dispersed surged, but it hasn't trickled into the actual construction activity yet. And that's because if you imagine, when you suddenly flood that sector with all this money, it takes time to buy the land, land acquisition, buy construction materials, this kind of stuff. So that will trickle into the growth in the second half of the year and next year as well. And the net conclusion of all that is, you should probably expect GDP growth of around 7% this year. So slower than the first half because of the exports that are slowing down, but the construction will be kicking in because of all the money that was dispersed in the first half of the year. The second topic is the Doi Moi 2.0 reforms are really getting a lot of traction and a lot of discussion, and as they should, because this is really important for the economy going forward. So far what we see is a real major mindset change in both the civil servants that work in the government and really even the population writ large. To me, I look at it as something similar as when Reagan came into office or when Thatcher came into office, for example. It's a real shift in the mindset of the country's economic trajectory going forward. The details are fairly complicated. It's split into these 4 resolutions that are called the 4 pillars, and we're going to be publishing some reports about that, going more into the details of what all that is about. But the important thing to know is that we're starting to see the first tangible results of the Doi Moi reforms. Massive shrinkage of the number of provinces, big rebound in infrastructure spending, and as I said, that will help fuel the economy in the second half of the year and next year as well. And then, of course, the topic that everyone is asking the most about is about the tariffs. And based on everything that we have seen so far, and we know either directly or one hand removed, people that were directly involved in the negotiations, either on the Vietnam side and also on the US side, it really looks like both negotiation teams we're kind of zeroing on around a 15% level of tariffs before Trump just kind of threw this 20% number out, and that got reported in the newspapers and still being discussed a lot. The real politic of the situation is that the actual details are really still being negotiated, and I personally expect that we'll come to a number below 20%, probably around 15 to 16%. The other thing that Trump threw out there when he did this tweet about the tariffs was that there was going to be a 40% tariff on so-called transshipments from China to the US via Vietnam. There's no definition of what transshipment actually means. And this is something we like to cite, is that Harvard University did all this research trying to figure out what proportion of Vietnam's exports to the US are transshipments. And the range of estimates is huge. It's like from below 2% to 18%. So that really shows there is no definition. And so I think this is more of a symbolic measure, and I don't think there'll be any substantial proportion of Vietnam's exports that get this kind of high tariff. The key thing to really keep in mind is that it's not in the US interest to really overly target Vietnam, because for one thing, it's going to reduce the US negotiation position vis-a-vis China. And what we found out is that the negotiation position of the US with China is not that great, because once Trump really started talking some very big numbers on tariffs on China, then the Chinese effectively cut off the supply of rare earths that the US industry and the military industry needs as well. And the other thing is, we've done a table here. You can see if you put Vietnam and China together, the proportion of imports of certain key products that come from Vietnam and China together is huge. I mean, look at this, almost 60% on cell phones. So it's just not really practical for the US to target both Vietnam and China aggressively. And as a result of that, you see that the Chinese companies in general were, it was considered better than feared, the tariffs that were announced. So those are the top three things to focus on. And what we're going to do next is my coworker Tom is going to come up. We're going to set up the table. I'm going to go through some Q&A. So we'll pause it there.
Thanks, Mike. Always very interesting presentation from you. So for the next 5 minutes, we'll do a quick Q&A fire chat just to dive into a few other details of your presentation. To stick with the tariffs, can you mention, has tariff really impacted the FDI flows for Vietnam?
No, not at all. Actually, this year we're having a surge of, well, first of all, the disbursement, the actual money flowing in, is up almost 10%, although some of that was planned from before. But the point is, there were no cancellations or anything. And the planned FDI is up over 30%.
Wow.
No impact at all.
And what is the FDI as a percentage of GDP in the past? And what do you think going forward that would be?
Sophisticated question. No, it's a really high number. So in the past, Vietnam, there's a couple different ways to measure it, but it's called around 6% of GDP, which, by the way, is a humongous number. China never got over sort of 3, 4, something like that. But the planned figure is around 8% of GDP, and the actual inflows are around 5% of GDP. These are big numbers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, one other thing I want to touch is the infrastructure projects that you mentioned. It's been going up. Where is the government really getting the funding from?
Yeah, this is another great question. One of the things we've talked about a lot in our reports and these webinars is that the fiscal capacity of the government is very high. Vietnam's debt to GDP is very low. And actually, another thing we're seeing this year is, number one, they're running a huge budget surplus, like over 3% of GDP, which is incredible in the world. In the US, they're having a 6% of GDP deficit. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that. But the thing is that as part of these Doi Moi reforms, one of the things they're doing is widening the tax net. And we're seeing tax revenues are surging this year. More small businesses are coming into the fold, et cetera, et cetera. So if you combine the ability to make the tax net wider, get those small businesses into the formal financial system, very low debt to GDP, around 40%. They've got a lot of ability. Oh, sorry, and the most important thing, sorry, stupid, I forgot, is they've got like $40 billion of cash that they raised before that's like sitting in the banking system. Sometimes people ask, why is the interbank rate in Vietnam so absurdly low? Yeah, it's because there's like $40 billion that the government raised to do infrastructure spending that they haven't dispersed yet, that's just sitting there. So lots and lots of ample financial resources.
Right, I think just elaborate a little more on that. You know, on the bigger theme, there's digitalization that's happening in the country, right? So government is trying to move everything from cash basis online. That's one way they can really track money and collect more from to fund these projects.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe I'll round off with the last question, which I know we are not experts in the U.S. economy, but can you give your view on sort of what is the likelihood of U.S. recession or rising inflation? How does that has an impact on Vietnam?
So we watch very carefully what happens in the U.S. because that's our biggest export market. We made a very non-consensus prediction at the beginning of the year that inflation would go down until around the middle of the year and end this year back at probably around the 3% type level. And therefore, I would not be surprised if we don't see any Fed rate cuts. The good thing is that's pushed the value of the dollar down, which has taken some depreciation pressure off the dong. As far as the U.S. economy is concerned, we're not experts on the U.S., but I can almost guarantee you we'll be seeing a very big boom in the U.S. economy by late this year, early next year. Why? Because we just mentioned this huge budget deficit in the U.S. This big, beautiful bill that just passed, one of the most important things that's not being discussed that much in the news media is that if you want to construct a factory in the U.S. or other forms of capital expenditures, the Trump administration is going to give companies an immediate 100% tax deduction. Normally you have to depreciate that over time. So you're going to see a boom in building. There's other things going on that are going to inject a lot of liquidity into the market, which means money printing basically. So you'll see a very strong economy in the U.S. by next year. That will help our exports. So basically Vietnam's exports to the U.S. kind of slowed the second half of the year and then pick back up next year.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Mike. So as the theme of this is new format, we're trying to keep it very short. So if you have any questions, please email us at ir@vietnamcapital.com. Thank you.